The clock on the wall showed 2:15 a.m. when Rosa Martinez pushed her cleaning cart through the empty hallways of Carnegie Hall. Her worn sneakers made soft, squeaking sounds on the polished marble floor. She had been doing the same job for 12 long years, cleaning up after the world's most famous musicians performed on the legendary stage. Behind her, walking quietly with a backpack full of schoolbooks, was her daughter Elena. The 16-year-old girl had spent countless nights in these halls, doing her homework in the back seats while her mother worked. Rosa couldn't afford a babysitter, and Elena was too young to stay home alone in their small apartment in the Bronx. Elena knew every corner of this famous concert hall. She knew which bathroom stalls had broken locks, which dressing rooms had the brightest lights, and exactly how long it took her mother to clean each section. But most importantly, she knew the sound of every piano key, every violin string, and every note that had ever echoed through these walls. Rosa stopped her cart near the orchestra section and pulled out her supplies. The smell of cleaning solution mixed with the faint scent of expensive perfume left behind by earlier performers. She had seen hundreds of concerts from the shadows, always staying invisible while celebrities and wealthy audience members enjoyed the music. "Mija, don't forget your math homework," Rosa called softly to Elena, who was settling into her usual spot in the last row. The girl nodded and opened her textbook, but her eyes kept drifting to the stage where a magnificent black piano sat under a single spotlight. Elena had watched so many pianists sit at that exact bench. She had memorized the way their fingers moved across the keys, how they positioned their hands, and how their bodies swayed with the music. From classical masters playing Bach to modern artists performing their own compositions, she had absorbed every technique without even realizing it. While Rosa scrubbed the floors and emptied trash cans, Elena pretended to study. But her mind was always on the music. She could hear melodies in her head, complex pieces that she had watched being performed dozens of times. Her fingers would sometimes move silently on her desk, following along with the imaginary music in her mind. The other cleaning staff knew Elena well. They would smile and wave as they passed by with their carts. Some of them had children too, but most left them at home with relatives. Rosa didn't have that luxury. Her mother lived too far away and she couldn't afford childcare on her cleaning salary. "Why don't you play piano, Elena?" her mother had asked once, years ago when Elena was just 8 years old. "We don't have a piano, Mama," Elena had replied simply, "and lessons cost too much money." Rosa's heart had broken a little that day. She wanted to give her daughter everything, but working as a cleaner barely paid for their rent and food. Piano lessons and instruments were luxuries for families with money, not for people like them. Elena never complained about spending her nights in the concert hall. She actually preferred it to their tiny apartment. Here she was surrounded by beauty and music. Here she could dream about what it might feel like to sit at that piano and make those beautiful sounds herself. As the night went on, Rosa moved to different sections of the hall. She cleaned the bathrooms, vacuumed the carpets in the lobby, and polished the brass railings on the stairs. Elena followed along, carrying her books and always staying quiet. They had learned to be invisible, to do their work without disturbing the magic of the place. Sometimes late at night, famous musicians would come back to practice. Elena had seen world-renowned pianists working on difficult pieces, playing the same section over and over until it was perfect. She watched how they positioned their bodies, how they used their whole arm to create powerful sounds, and how they touched the keys gently for soft, delicate passages. Rosa noticed how her daughter's eyes lit up during these private practice sessions. She saw how Elena stopped pretending to read and focused completely on the musicians. It worried her sometimes. She didn't want Elena to develop impossible dreams that would only lead to disappointment. "Education is the most important thing," Rosa would remind her daughter. "Study hard, get good grades, and maybe you can have a better life than this." Elena always nodded and agreed, but deep down, she felt something pulling at her heart every time she heard music. It was like a language she understood perfectly, even though she had never formally learned it. The notes spoke to her in ways that words couldn't express. By 4 a.m., Rosa's shift was almost over. She made her final rounds, checking that everything was clean and ready for the next day's events. Elena packed up her books, most of her homework still unfinished because she had been distracted by the phantom melodies in her head. As they prepared to leave, Elena took one last look at the piano on stage. The spotlight had been turned off and the instrument sat in darkness, but she could still imagine the music it was capable of creating. She could hear the songs in her mind waiting to be played. Mother and daughter walked out into the early morning darkness, heading home to catch a few hours of sleep before Elena had to go to school. Rosa was tired as always, but proud that she was able to provide for her family. Elena was tired too, but her mind was still buzzing with music. Neither of them knew that this routine was about to change forever. Neither could imagine that Elena's years of watching and learning from the shadows were about to lead to something extraordinary. The stage was set for a moment that would transform their lives completely. As they waited for the subway train, Elena hummed a melody under her breath. It was a piece by Chopin that she had heard performed 3 nights earlier. Rosa heard her daughter's soft humming and smiled. She had no idea that Elena could replicate the complex classical pieces perfectly, just from memory. She thought it was just a simple tune her daughter had picked up somewhere. The train arrived and they climbed aboard for the journey home. Elena pressed her face against the window and watched the city pass by in the early morning light. In just a few hours she would be back at Carnegie Hall, sitting in the shadows, watching and learning and dreaming of the day she might touch those piano keys herself. The clock on the wall showed 2:15 a.m. when Rosa Martinez pushed her cleaning cart through the empty hallways of Carnegie Hall. Her worn sneakers made soft squeaking sounds on the polished marble floor. She had been doing this same job for 12 long years, cleaning up after the world's most famous musicians performed on the legendary stage. Behind her, walking quietly with a backpack full of school books, was her daughter Elena. The 16-year-old girl had spent countless nights in these halls, doing her homework in the back seats while her mother worked. Rosa couldn't afford a babysitter, and Elena was too young to stay home alone in their small apartment in the Bronx. Elena knew every corner of this famous concert hall. She knew which bathroom stalls had broken locks, which dressing rooms had the brightest lights, and exactly how long it took her mother to clean each section. But most importantly, she knew the sound of every piano key, every violin string, and every note that had ever echoed through these walls. Rosa stopped her cart near the orchestra section and pulled out her supplies. The smell of cleaning solution mixed with the faint scent of expensive perfume left behind by earlier performers. She had seen hundreds of concerts from the shadows, always staying invisible while celebrities and wealthy audience members enjoyed the music. "Mija, don't forget your math homework," Rosa called softly to Elena, who was settling into her usual spot in the last row. The girl nodded and opened her textbook, but her eyes kept drifting to the stage where a magnificent black piano sat under a single spotlight. Elena had watched so many pianists sit at that exact bench. She had memorized the way their fingers moved across the keys, how they positioned their hands, and how their bodies swayed with the music. From classical masters playing Bach to modern artists performing their own compositions, she had absorbed every technique without even realizing it. While Rosa scrubbed the floors and emptied trash cans, Elena pretended to study, but her mind was always on the music. She could hear melodies in her head, complex pieces that she had watched being performed dozens of times. Her fingers would sometimes move silently on her desk, following along with the imaginary music in her mind. The other cleaning staff knew Elena well. They would smile and wave as they passed by with their carts. Some of them had children too, but most left them at home with relatives. Rosa didn't have that luxury. Her mother lived too far away and she couldn't afford childcare on her cleaning salary. "Why don't you play piano, Elena?" her mother had asked once years ago when Elena was just 8 years old. "We don't have a piano, Mama," Elena had replied simply, "and lessons cost too much money." Rosa's heart had broken a little that day. She wanted to give her daughter everything, but working as a cleaner barely paid for their rent and food. Piano lessons and instruments were luxuries for families with money, not for people like them. Elena never complained about spending her nights in the concert hall. She actually preferred it to their tiny apartment. Here she was surrounded by beauty and music. Here she could dream about what it might feel like to sit at that piano and make those beautiful sounds herself. As the night went on, Rosa moved to different sections of the hall. She cleaned the bathrooms, vacuumed the carpets in the lobby, and polished the brass railings on the stairs. Elena followed along, carrying her books and always staying quiet. They had learned to be invisible, to do their work without disturbing the magic of the place. Sometimes late at night, famous musicians would come back to practice. Elena had seen world-renowned pianists working on difficult pieces, playing the same section over and over until it was perfect. She watched how they positioned their bodies, how they used their whole arm to create powerful sounds, and how they touched the keys gently for soft, delicate passages. Rosa noticed how her daughter's eyes lit up during these private practice sessions. She saw how Elena stopped pretending to read and focused completely on the musicians. It worried her sometimes. She didn't want Elena to develop impossible dreams that would only lead to disappointment. Education is the most important thing, Rosa would remind her daughter. Study hard, get good grades, and maybe you can have a better life than this. Elena always nodded and agreed, but deep down, she felt something pulling at her heart every time she heard music. It was like a language she understood perfectly, even though she had never formally learned it. The notes spoke to her in ways that words couldn't express. By 4 a.m., Rosa's shift was almost over. She made her final rounds, checking that everything was clean and ready for the next day's events. Elena packed up her books, most of her homework still unfinished because she had been distracted by the phantom melodies in her head. As they prepared to leave, Elena took one last look at the piano on stage. The spotlight had been turned off and the instrument sat in darkness. But she could still imagine the music it was capable of creating. She could hear the songs in her mind waiting to be played. Mother and daughter walked out into the early morning darkness, heading home to catch a few hours of sleep before Elena had to go to school. Rosa was tired as always, but proud that she was able to provide for her family. Elena was tired too, but her mind was still buzzing with music. Neither of them knew that this routine was about to change forever. Neither could imagine that Elena's years of watching and learning from the shadows were about to lead to something extraordinary. The stage was set for a moment that would transform their lives completely. As they waited for the subway train, Elena hummed a melody under her breath. It was a piece by Chopin that she had heard performed 3 nights earlier. Rosa heard her daughter's soft humming and smiled. She had no idea that Elena could replicate the complex classical pieces perfectly, just from memory. She thought it was just a simple tune her daughter had picked up somewhere. The train arrived and they climbed aboard for the journey home. Elena pressed her face against the window and watched the city pass by in the early morning light. In just a few hours, she would be back at Carnegie Hall, sitting in the shadows watching and learning and dreaming of the day she might touch those piano keys herself. Elena's fingers found their rhythm, and suddenly the Chopin waltz was flowing from the piano like water from a spring. The melody she had carried in her head for weeks was finally free, dancing through the empty concert hall with a life of its own. She couldn't believe that her own hands were creating these beautiful sounds. The music felt natural, as if she had been playing piano her entire life. Her left hand moved confidently across the lower keys, providing the gentle bass rhythm that supported the melody. Her right hand danced gracefully over the higher notes, creating the sweet, flowing tune that made the waltz so enchanting. Each note seemed to know exactly where it belonged. Elena's fingers moved without hesitation, following the pattern she had memorized through countless hours of watching professional pianists. She had absorbed every detail without even realizing it, and now all that observation was paying off in the most incredible way. As she played, Elena felt a sense of completeness she had never experienced before. This was what she was meant to do. This was the missing piece of her life that she hadn't even known she was looking for. The piano wasn't just an instrument to her. It was a way of speaking, a way of expressing feelings that words could never capture. The waltz grew more complex as it progressed, with rapid passages that required both hands to work together in perfect coordination. Elena's years of watching had taught her how to navigate these challenging sections. She had seen pianists practice these same difficult parts over and over, and now she understood why they had to repeat them so many times. But somehow, Elena's fingers seemed to know exactly what to do. When the melody called for a gentle touch, her fingers barely whispered across the keys. When the music demanded power and drama, her whole arm contributed to creating the fuller, richer sound. It was as if her body had been secretly learning all along, storing up every technique she had observed. The acoustics of Carnegie Hall made every note ring with crystal clarity. Elena had heard hundreds of performances in this space, but she had never realized how the hall itself was part of the magic. The sound seemed to come alive in the air around her, growing and expanding until it filled every corner of the vast auditorium. She closed her eyes and let the music carry her away. In her mind, she wasn't a cleaning lady's daughter sitting alone on a stage in the middle of the night. She was a real pianist performing for an audience of thousands, sharing the beauty of Chopin's music with people who understood and appreciated its elegance. The waltz had sections that were playful and light, like dancers spinning around a ballroom floor. Elena's fingers seemed to laugh as they played these parts, bouncing lightly across the keys with joy and freedom. Then the music would shift to something more romantic and dreamy, and her touch became softer, more tender. She had watched pianists express these different emotions through their playing, and now she understood how it worked. The music wasn't just about pressing the right keys at the right time. It was about feeling the emotions that the composer had written into the piece, and then sharing those feelings with anyone who was listening. Elena realized she was swaying slightly as she played. Just like the professional musicians she had observed, her body was naturally moving with the rhythm of the waltz, helping her hands create the proper flow and expression. Everything she had learned by watching was coming together in this magical moment. The middle section of the waltz was the most challenging part, with both hands playing rapid, intricate passages that wove together like two dancers performing an elaborate routine. Elena had always been amazed when she watched pianists navigate this section, wondering how they could possibly keep track of so many notes at once. But now, as her own hands played these same passages, she understood that it wasn't about thinking through every single note. It was about feeling the pattern, understanding the logic of how the melody and harmony worked together. Her fingers seemed to know where they were going before her mind had time to think about it. The sound of the piano in the empty hall was absolutely magical. Every note hung in the air for a moment before blending with the next one, creating layers of harmony that seemed to float above the stage. Elena had never heard anything so beautiful in her life, and she could hardly believe that she was the one creating it. As the waltz moved toward its conclusion, Elena felt a mixture of joy and sadness. She didn't want this moment to end. She wanted to keep playing forever, to explore every piece of music she had ever heard, to discover what other melodies were hiding in her memory, waiting to be set free. The final notes of the waltz were soft and gentle, like a sigh of contentment at the end of a perfect day. Elena played them with the same tenderness she had seen in the professional performances, letting each note fade naturally into silence. When the last sound died away, she sat perfectly still, her hands still resting on the keys. The silence that followed was profound and complete. Elena opened her eyes and looked around the empty hall, almost surprised to find herself alone. The music had been so real, so alive, that she had forgotten where she was. For those few minutes, the whole world had consisted of nothing but her, the piano, and Chopin's beautiful waltz. Her heart was beating fast, not from the physical effort of playing, but from the emotional intensity of the experience. She had just done something that should have been impossible. She had played a complex classical piece perfectly, despite never having had a single piano lesson in her life. Elena looked down at her hands, still hardly believing what they had just accomplished. These were the same hands that helped her mother fold laundry, that wrote her homework assignments, that had never touched a piano key until tonight. How had they known what to do? She wanted to play something else to see if that first piece had been just a lucky accident, or if she really could do this. But then she heard the sound of her mother's cleaning cart in the distance, getting closer to the main auditorium. Rosa would be finished with the backstage area soon, and Elena needed to be back in her seat with her homework when her mother returned. What Elena didn't know was that someone else was in the building that night. David Kim, one of the world's most celebrated pianists, had returned to Carnegie Hall to retrieve his lucky fountain pen that he had left in his dressing room after the evening's performance. He never liked to leave anything behind, especially not the pen he had used to sign autographs for 20 years. David had been walking quietly through the backstage corridors when he heard the first notes of the Chopin waltz floating through the air. He stopped immediately, puzzled by what he was hearing. The hall should have been empty except for the cleaning crew, and none of them would be playing piano at this hour. The sound was coming from the main stage, so David made his way toward the auditorium, moving carefully in the dim lighting. As he got closer, the music became clearer and more distinct. Someone was playing the Chopin waltz, and they were playing it beautifully. The touch was sensitive, the rhythm was perfect, and the emotional expression was remarkably mature. David reached the edge of the auditorium and peered through the doorway. What he saw made him freeze in complete amazement. A young girl, probably a teenager, was sitting at the piano with her eyes closed, completely lost in the music she was creating. She was dressed in simple clothes with a backpack sitting nearby, and she played with a kind of natural grace that money couldn't buy. He listened in stunned silence as she navigated the challenging middle section of the waltz. This wasn't just someone playing the notes correctly. This was real musical expression. The girl understood the piece on a deep level, bringing out subtle details that many professional pianists missed. Her technique was flawless, her timing was impeccable, and her interpretation was both personal and authentic. David had heard this waltz performed by some of the greatest pianists in the world. He had played it himself in concert hundreds of times, but there was something special about hearing it now, played by this unknown girl in an empty concert hall at 2 a.m. The music seemed fresh and new, as if he was discovering it for the first time. As the waltz reached its gentle conclusion, David found himself holding his breath. The final notes seemed to float in the air before fading into silence. The girl sat perfectly still for a moment, her hands resting on the keys, looking like she couldn't quite believe what she had just done. David stepped into the auditorium and began to clap softly. The sound of his applause echoed through the empty hall, and the girl's eyes flew open in shock. She looked around frantically, spotted him standing in the aisle, and immediately jumped up from the piano bench looking terrified. "Please don't run," David called out gently, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "That was absolutely beautiful. I've never heard anything like it." Elena's face went pale with fear. She had been caught doing something she wasn't supposed to do, and by someone who looked like he belonged in this fancy concert hall. She grabbed her backpack and started moving toward the edge of the stage, ready to run if necessary. "Wait," David said, walking slowly down the aisle toward the stage. "I'm not going to get you in trouble. I'm a musician too. My name is David Kim. I performed here earlier tonight." Elena recognized the name immediately. She had watched David Kim perform just a few hours earlier, had observed his technique during his sound check, had memorized the way he approached difficult passages. This was one of the most famous pianists in the world, and she had just been caught playing piano in front of him. I'm sorry," Elena stammered, still clutching her backpack. "I know I'm not supposed to touch the piano. My mom works here and I didn't mean to." "How long have you been playing?" David asked, his voice full of genuine curiosity rather than anger. Elena looked confused by the question. "Playing? I don't play piano. I mean, I've never had lessons or anything. This was the first time I ever touched a real piano." David's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. "That's impossible. What you just played requires years of training. The technique, the expression, the musical understanding. You can't just pick that up from nowhere." "I watch," Elena said quietly, still ready to bolt if this conversation went badly. "I've been coming here with my mom for years while she cleans. I watch the musicians practice and perform. I guess I just learned by watching." David stared at her for a long moment, trying to process what she was telling him. He had heard of musical prodigies before, children who showed unusual talent at a young age, but he had never encountered anything like this. To play Chopin at that level with no formal training was simply unheard of. "Would you be willing to play something else?" he asked gently. "I promise you're not in trouble. I need to understand what I just witnessed." Elena hesitated, looking toward the backstage area where her mother was still working. She could hear the distant sound of Rosa's cleaning cart, which meant she still had a few minutes before her mother returned to the main auditorium. "I don't know very many pieces," Elena admitted. "Just the ones I've heard performed here." "That's fine," David encouraged. "Play anything you want. Whatever feels natural to you." Elena looked at the piano, then back at David. This felt like a dream, like something that couldn't possibly be happening in real life, but the kind expression on David's face made her feel a little less afraid. She had watched him perform many times, and he had always seemed like a gentle, thoughtful person. Slowly, she walked back to the piano and sat down at the bench. She thought for a moment about what to play, then decided on a piece by Bach that she had heard performed the previous month. It was technically challenging but emotionally simple, which seemed like a good choice for this surreal situation. Elena placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The Bach piece unfolded with mathematical precision, each note perfectly placed and clearly articulated. Her fingers moved with confidence and accuracy, demonstrating a technical ability that most pianists spent years developing. David listened in growing amazement. This wasn't just talent. This was something approaching genius. The girl's musical instincts were extraordinary, her technical skills were remarkable, and her ability to learn complex pieces just from observation was unlike anything he had ever encountered in his 30-year career. When Elena finished the Bach piece, David applauded again, more enthusiastically this time. "That was incredible," he said, shaking his head in wonder. "I've never seen anything like this. You have a gift that is truly extraordinary." David Kim couldn't contain his excitement about what he had just witnessed. After talking with Elena for a few more minutes and learning more about her incredible story, he knew he had to share this discovery with his colleagues. This kind of raw, untrained talent was something that appeared maybe once in a generation, and it needed to be nurtured properly. "Elena, would you mind if I called a few of my musician friends?" David asked. "They need to hear this for themselves. What you can do is so rare and special that other people should know about it." Elena looked nervous about the idea of more people coming to hear her play. She was already worried about getting in trouble for being on the stage, and the thought of more attention made her uncomfortable. But there was something trustworthy about David's manner that made her feel safe. "Will I get in trouble?" she asked quietly. "My mom could lose her job if someone thinks we're doing something wrong." "I promise you won't get in trouble," David assured her. "These are good people who love music just as much as I do. They'll want to help you, not hurt you." While they were talking, David was already reaching for his phone. He called Victoria Reyes, a world-renowned violinist who lived just a few blocks away from Carnegie Hall. Then he called Robert Chen, a conductor who had worked with some of the greatest orchestras in the world. Finally, he called Lisa Johnson, another pianist who taught at the most prestigious music conservatory in the city. "You have to come to Carnegie Hall right now," David told each of them. "I can't explain over the phone, but I've just discovered something incredible. Trust me on this one." All three musicians knew David well enough to take his call seriously. He wasn't the type of person who got overly excited about small things, so if he was asking them to come out at this hour of the night, it had to be something truly extraordinary. Elena spent the next 20 minutes nervously pacing around the stage while David tried to reassure her that everything would be fine. She kept looking toward the backstage area, listening for her mother's cleaning cart, and hoping Rosa wouldn't return before this strange situation was resolved. Victoria arrived first, having literally run the 3 blocks from her apartment. She was still wearing her pajamas under a long coat, and her hair was tied up in a messy bun. "David, this better be good," she said as she hurried down the aisle. "I was sound asleep when you called." "Just wait," David said with a huge smile. "Elena, this is Victoria." "Victoria, meet Elena." Robert and Lisa arrived together about 10 minutes later, both looking curious and slightly annoyed at being woken up in the middle of the night. Robert was carrying a travel mug of coffee, and Lisa had clearly thrown on the first clothes she could find. "Okay, David, we're all here," Robert said, settling into one of the front row seats. "What's this big discovery you couldn't wait until morning to share?" David turned to Elena, who was standing nervously beside the piano. "Elena, would you please play something for my friends? Maybe that Chopin waltz you played for me earlier?" Elena looked at the 3 new faces staring up at her from the audience. These were all famous musicians, people she had watched perform on this very stage. The idea of playing for them seemed impossible and terrifying. But David's encouraging smile gave her the courage to sit down at the piano bench. She took a deep breath and began the Chopin waltz again. From the very first notes, the 3 musicians in the audience sat up straighter in their seats. Victoria's mouth fell open slightly. Robert set down his coffee cup and leaned forward. Lisa gripped the armrests of her chair. As Elena continued playing, the 3 musicians exchanged amazed glances. They had all heard David's excited phone calls, but they had assumed he was exaggerating. Now they realized he hadn't been exaggerating at all. If anything, he had understated what they were witnessing. The waltz flowed beautifully through the empty concert hall, filled with the same sensitivity and technical mastery that had amazed David earlier. Elena's fingers moved with confidence and grace, showing no sign of nervousness despite her obvious stage fright. She was completely absorbed in the music, transported to that same magical place where nothing existed except the piano and the melody. When the piece ended, The silence was profound. The three musicians sat in stunned amazement, trying to process what they had just heard. Finally, Victoria broke the silence. "How long have you been studying piano?" she asked, her voice filled with awe. "I don't study piano," Elena replied quietly. "I've never had lessons. I just watch people play when they practice here." Robert looked at David with disbelief. "Are you telling me she learned to play like that just from watching?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," David confirmed. "Elena, tell them about how you spend your nights here." Elena explained about her mother's job cleaning Carnegie Hall and how she had been coming here for years while Rosa worked. She talked about watching countless rehearsals and performances, absorbing every detail of how the musicians played their instruments. "I never thought I could actually do it myself," Elena admitted. "Tonight was the first time I ever touched the piano. But all those pieces are just in my head, I guess. I remember how they're supposed to sound." Lisa, the piano teacher, shook her head in amazement. "Elena, what you just played requires years of technical training. The finger coordination, the musical phrasing, the dynamic control. These are advanced skills that most of my students take a decade to develop." "Play something else," Victoria requested. "Something different from the Chopin." Elena thought for a moment, then began a piece by Rachmaninoff that she had heard performed just the week before. This piece was much more technically demanding than the Chopin waltz, with rapid passages that required both hands to work independently and complex harmonies that challenged even experienced pianists. But Elena played it flawlessly, her hands flying across the keys with remarkable precision. The Rachmaninoff piece was passionate and dramatic, and Elena seemed to understand exactly how to bring out its emotional intensity. Her playing was mature beyond her years, showing a deep musical understanding that couldn't be taught in any classroom. When she finished, Robert actually started laughing in disbelief. "This is impossible," he said, but he was smiling as he said it.
"David, how did you find her?"
"I didn't find her," David replied. "She's been here all along, learning from all of us without us even knowing it. Elena has been the best student any of us ever had, and we didn't even realize we were teaching her." The three musicians began talking excitedly among themselves, discussing Elena's remarkable abilities and what should be done to help develop her talent. Elena listened to their conversation with growing amazement. These world-famous artists were talking about her as if she was a real musician, as if her dreams of playing piano weren't impossible after all. Just as the four musicians were deep in conversation about Elena's extraordinary talent, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching from the backstage area. Elena's eyes went wide with panic as she recognized the familiar squeaking of her mother's cleaning cart wheels on the polished floor. "That's my mom," Elena whispered urgently. "She's going to be so upset if she finds me here with all of you." Rosa Martinez appeared at the edge of the stage area, pushing her cart and looking tired after a long night of cleaning. When she saw her daughter sitting at the piano surrounded by four adults in expensive clothes, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her face went pale with worry and embarrassment. "Elena," Rosa called out in Spanish, her voice sharp with concern. "What are you doing? Get away from there right now." Elena quickly stood up from the piano bench and started walking toward her mother, her head down in shame. "I'm sorry, Mama, I was just—" "Ma'am, please don't be upset with Elena," David said quickly, walking over to Rosa with his hands raised peacefully. "She's not in any trouble. In fact, we've just discovered something absolutely incredible about your daughter." Rosa looked suspiciously at the group of well-dressed strangers. She had worked in this building long enough to recognize wealthy, important people when she saw them. These were probably donors or board members, and Elena had somehow managed to disturb them while they were having some kind of meeting. "I'm very sorry if my daughter bothered you," Rosa said in careful English, her accent thick with exhaustion and worry. "She knows she's not supposed to touch anything. It won't happen again." "Mrs. Martinez," Victoria said gently, stepping forward with a warm smile, "your daughter has just played some of the most beautiful piano music I've ever heard. She has a gift that is truly extraordinary." Rosa looked confused and skeptical. "Piano music?" "Elena doesn't play piano. We don't have money for lessons or instruments. That's what makes this so remarkable," Robert explained. "Elena has learned to play just by watching and listening. She's completely self-taught and she plays at a professional level." Rosa's expression shifted from suspicion to disbelief. She knew her daughter loved music and had always paid attention during the concerts, but the idea that Elena could actually play piano seemed impossible. "Show her," Lisa encouraged Elena. "Play something for your mother." Elena looked back and forth between her mother and the piano, uncertain about what to do. Rosa was still looking skeptical, but there was curiosity in her eyes now, too. "Go ahead, Mija," Rosa said softly. "If these people say you can play, then show me." Elena sat back down at the piano and chose a gentle piece by Debussy, something soft and beautiful that wouldn't seem too overwhelming to her mother. As the delicate melody filled the concert hall, Rosa's expression changed completely. Her mouth opened in amazement and tears began to form in her eyes. She had heard this same piece performed on this very stage just a few months earlier, and now her own daughter was playing it with the same grace and skill as the famous pianist who had visited that night. Rosa couldn't believe what she was seeing and hearing. When Elena finished, Rosa walked slowly toward the stage, still looking stunned. "How did you learn to do this?" she asked in Spanish. "I watched, Mama," Elena replied in the same language. "All those nights while you were working, I was watching and learning. I didn't know I could actually do it until tonight." The four musicians had been listening to this conversation, even though they couldn't understand the Spanish. David stepped forward to address Rosa directly. "Mrs. Martinez, your daughter has the kind of natural musical ability that appears maybe once in a generation. With proper training and support, she could become one of the great pianists of her time." Rosa shook her head, still struggling to process what she had just witnessed. "But we don't have money for piano lessons. I work as a cleaner. We can barely afford our rent." "That's exactly what we want to talk to you about," Victoria said warmly. "Elena's talent is so exceptional that we want to help her develop it. We're prepared to arrange everything she needs: piano lessons, instruments, music theory, performance opportunities, all at no cost to your family." Lisa nodded enthusiastically. "I teach at the Manhattan Music Conservatory. I would be honored to give Elena private lessons, completely free of charge. She could also audition for our scholarship program, which would cover all expenses if she decided to pursue formal musical education." Robert added, "I have connections with several foundations that support young musical talents. Elena's story and abilities would make her an ideal candidate for financial assistance." Rosa looked overwhelmed by these generous offers. After years of struggling to provide for her daughter on a cleaner's salary, the idea that Elena might have opportunities for a better life seemed too good to be true. "Why would you do this for us?" Rosa asked suspiciously. "What do you want in return?" David smiled at her directness. "We don't want anything in return. When you encounter a talent like Elena's, you have a responsibility to help nurture it. Music is a gift that's meant to be shared with the world, and Elena has that gift in abundance. We've all been blessed with successful musical careers," Victoria explained. "This is our way of giving back, of ensuring that the next generation of musicians has the same opportunities we had." Elena had been listening to this conversation with growing excitement and disbelief. The idea that she could actually study music formally, that she could have her own piano and real lessons, seemed like an impossible dream coming true. "Mama," Elena said quietly, "this is what I want to do more than anything in the world. When I play piano, I feel like this is what I was meant to do with my life." Rosa looked at her daughter's hopeful face, then at the four kind musicians who were offering to change their lives forever. She had worked so hard to give Elena opportunities for a better future, and now that future was being offered to them by strangers who had heard her daughter play for just a few minutes. "I need to think about this," Rosa said carefully. "This is a big decision and I want to make sure it's the right thing for Elena." "Of course," Lisa replied. "This is a lot to process all at once. But please know that these offers are genuine, and we're prepared to do whatever it takes to help Elena develop her remarkable gifts." The musicians exchanged contact information with Rosa and Elena, promising to follow up in a few days to discuss the details of how they could help. As they prepared to leave Carnegie Hall, all four of them were still amazed by what they had discovered that night. Elena hugged each of the musicians, thanking them for their kindness and for believing in her abilities. For the first time in her life, her dreams of playing piano didn't seem impossible. Instead, they seemed like the beginning of an incredible journey that was just waiting to unfold. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions for Rosa and Elena Martinez. After the incredible encounter at Carnegie Hall, They found themselves facing a decision that could change their lives forever. Rosa had barely slept since that night, her mind racing with questions and concerns about the generous offers from the four musicians. On Thursday evening, Rosa sat at their small kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at the business cards that David, Victoria, Robert, and Lisa had given her. Elena was in her room doing homework, but Rosa could hear her humming classical melodies under her breath. It was something Elena had always done, but now Rosa realized these weren't just random tunes. They were complex pieces her daughter had memorized from years of watching performances. Rosa's first instinct was to be suspicious of the offers. In her experience, when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. Rich people didn't just give away expensive music education to poor families without expecting something in return. She worried that there might be hidden conditions or that the promises would disappear once the musicians had time to think about what they had committed to. But even more than suspicion, Rosa felt fear. She was afraid that Elena might get her hopes up only to be disappointed later. She was afraid that accepting help from wealthy strangers might somehow put them in debt or create obligations they couldn't fulfill. Most of all, she was afraid of change. Their life was hard, but it was stable and predictable. Rosa knew how to clean buildings and support her family. She didn't know how to navigate the world of classical music and elite educational institutions. Elena, on the other hand, could think of nothing but the possibility of learning to play piano properly. She had always known that her dreams of becoming a musician were unrealistic, given their financial situation. But now, for the first time, those dreams seemed within reach. She found herself distracted at school, imagining what it would be like to have her own piano, to take real lessons, to learn pieces beyond what she could observe from the shadows of Carnegie Hall. On Friday, Lisa called to check in and see if Rosa and Elena had any questions about the offers that had been made. Rosa found herself expressing all of her concerns and fears to the kind piano teacher. "I don't understand why you would do this for people you don't know," Rosa said honestly. "Elena is talented, yes, but there must be many talented children who need help. Why us?" Lisa was patient and understanding in her response. "Mrs. Martinez, in my 30 years of teaching music, I have never encountered raw talent like Elena's. What she can do is genuinely extraordinary. When we find someone with that level of natural ability, we have a responsibility to help them develop it. But what if Elena can't keep up with the other students? What if she's not as good as you think she is? What if we're not the kind of family that belongs in your world?" "Those are all understandable concerns," Lisa replied gently. "But Elena's talent speaks for itself. As for belonging in our world, music doesn't care about your bank account or your background. Some of the greatest musicians in history came from humble beginnings." Rosa still felt uncertain, so Lisa suggested that they start small. Instead of jumping into a full scholarship program immediately, Elena could begin with a few private lessons to see how she responded to formal instruction. If it went well, they could gradually increase her involvement in musical education. David also called that weekend to address Rosa's concerns about accepting what seemed like charity. "Mrs. Martinez, this isn't charity," he explained. "This is an investment in Elena's future and in the future of music itself. When someone has Elena's gifts, helping them develop those gifts benefits everyone." Robert reached out with practical solutions to some of Rosa's worries. He had contacted several music foundations and explained Elena's situation. 3 different organizations had already expressed interest in providing financial support for her musical education. He also knew of programs that could help with transportation, instruments, and other practical needs. Victoria offered the most reassuring perspective of all. She shared her own story of growing up in a working-class family, and how mentors had helped her pursue music despite financial obstacles. "I understand your fears," Victoria told Rosa. "But I also know what it's like to have dreams that seem impossible because of money. Elena doesn't have to choose between music and security. With the right support, she can have both." Gradually, Rosa began to feel more comfortable with the idea of accepting help. The musicians weren't pushing her to make a quick decision, and they were addressing all of her practical concerns with concrete solutions. Most importantly, they were treating Elena and Rosa with respect and dignity, not as charity cases who should be grateful for whatever they were offered. Elena was becoming more excited and hopeful with each passing day. She had been researching the Manhattan Music Conservatory online and reading about other young musicians who had received scholarships. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that this was the path she wanted to pursue. The turning point came when Rosa had a long conversation with Elena about what she truly wanted for her future. Elena explained that music wasn't just a hobby or a passing interest for her. It was something she felt called to do. She talked about how playing piano that night at Carnegie Hall had felt like coming home, like discovering who she was meant to be. "Mama, when I play music, I feel like I'm doing what God put me on earth to do," Elena said earnestly. "I know it's scary to accept help from people we don't know well, but what if this is meant to be? What if this is how we're supposed to change our lives for the better?" Rosa realized that her fears were holding back not just Elena's dreams, but Elena's destiny. She had worked so hard to give her daughter opportunities for a better life. And now that those opportunities were being offered, she was too afraid to accept them. After a week of careful consideration and many conversations with the musicians, Rosa made her decision. She called Lisa and told her that Elena would be honored to begin piano lessons. She also accepted Robert's help in applying for scholarship programs and David's offer to provide a practice piano for their apartment. When Rosa told Elena the news, her daughter burst into tears of joy and hugged her mother tightly. "Thank you, Mama," Elena whispered. "Thank you for believing in me and for being brave enough to let me try." Rosa hugged her daughter back, feeling a mixture of excitement and terror about the journey they were about to begin. She knew that their lives would never be the same, but for the first time, she believed that the changes would be for the better. The next chapter of their story was about to begin, and it would be filled with challenges, triumphs, and discoveries they could never have imagined when Rosa was just a cleaning lady, and Elena was just a girl who watched musicians from the shadows. 2 years had passed since that magical night when Elena first touched the piano at Carnegie Hall. 2 years of intensive study, practice, performances, and incredible growth. Now, on a crisp evening in October, Elena found herself standing in the same backstage area where her mother had cleaned for so many years. But this time she was preparing for her debut solo performance. The journey to this moment had been extraordinary. Lisa had been true to her word, providing Elena with exceptional piano instruction that built upon her natural abilities while filling in the technical gaps in her musical education. Elena had proven to be not just talented but also incredibly dedicated and hardworking. She practiced 4 hours every day, studied music theory with the passion of a scholar, and absorbed every lesson with remarkable speed. Within 6 months, Elena had been accepted into the Manhattan Music Conservatory's prestigious youth program with a full scholarship. She had performed in student recitals, competed in regional competitions, and even won several awards for young pianists. But tonight would be different. Tonight, she would perform as a featured soloist with the Carnegie Hall Orchestra, playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most challenging and beloved pieces in the classical repertoire. Elena stood in front of the dressing room mirror, adjusting her elegant black concert dress. It was hard to believe that this was the same girl who used to sit in the back row with her homework, while her mother cleaned. The transformation wasn't just in her appearance or her musical abilities. It was in her confidence, her poise, and her sense of belonging in this world that had once seemed so far beyond her reach. Rosa knocked softly on the dressing room door before entering. She was wearing her finest dress, a navy blue outfit she had bought specifically for this special night. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she carried herself with the pride of a mother whose daughter was about to achieve something extraordinary. "How are you feeling, Mija?" Rosa asked, placing her hands on Elena's shoulders and looking at her daughter's reflection in the mirror. "Nervous," Elena admitted with a smile, "but also excited. I keep thinking about that first night when I played the piano. I was so scared then, and now look where we are." Rosa's eyes filled with tears as she remembered that night 2 years ago. She thought about all the changes they had been through together. The new apartment they had been able to afford thanks to Rosa's promotion to head of building maintenance. The piano that now sat in their living room. The opportunities that had opened up for both of them through Elena's musical success. "I'm so proud of you," Rosa whispered, adjusting a strand of Elena's hair, "not just because you're talented, but because you worked so hard to get here. You never gave up, even when the practice was difficult or when you felt overwhelmed by everything you had to learn." There was a knock at the door, and David Kim entered with a warm smile. He had become not just a mentor to Elena, but a close family friend over the past 2 years. He had guided her through the challenges of entering the professional music world, and had been there to offer advice and support whenever she needed it. 5 minutes until showtime, David announced. The hall is completely sold out. I've never seen so much excitement for a debut performance. Elena took a deep breath and looked at herself one more time in the mirror. In just a few minutes, she would walk out onto the same stage where she had first discovered her gift. But this time, instead of hiding in the shadows, she would be the center of attention, sharing her music with nearly 3,000 people. The three of them walked together toward the stage area. Elena could hear the murmur of the audience through the curtains, and she felt her heart beating faster with anticipation. Victoria, Robert, and Lisa were all in the audience tonight, along with many of the music teachers and fellow students who had become part of Elena's extended musical family. As they reached the wings of the stage, Elena paused and looked out at the concert hall where she had spent so many nights of her childhood. The seats that had always been empty during those late-night cleaning sessions were now filled with elegantly dressed audience members. The stage that had seemed so vast and intimidating was now familiar territory where she felt comfortable and confident. "Remember," David said quietly, "just play from your heart. Trust your instincts and let the music speak through you. You've prepared beautifully for this moment." Rosa hugged her daughter tightly. "I'll be in the front row watching every note," she whispered. "Break a leg, my beautiful musician." Elena walked to the edge of the stage and waited for her cue. The orchestra was already in place, and the conductor gave her an encouraging nod. This was it. The moment she had been working toward for 2 years, the culmination of a journey that had begun with a cleaning lady's daughter who dared to touch a piano in an empty concert hall. The curtains opened, and Elena walked gracefully across the stage to enthusiastic applause. She sat at the same piano where she had first discovered her gift, placed her hands on the familiar keys, and nodded to the conductor that she was ready to begin. The opening notes of the Rachmaninoff concerto filled Carnegie Hall with power and beauty. Elena's fingers danced across the keys with confidence and artistry, supported by the full orchestra in a musical conversation that was both technically brilliant and emotionally moving. She played with the same natural musicality that had amazed David that first night, but now enhanced by years of study and refinement. As the concerto progressed through its challenging passages and soaring melodies, Elena felt completely at peace. This was where she belonged. This was what she was meant to do. The music flowed through her and out into the hall, reaching every corner of the audience with its beauty and passion. Rosa sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter command the stage with such grace and skill. She thought about all the sacrifices and struggles they had endured over the years, and how they had all led to this perfect moment. Her daughter wasn't just playing piano, she was fulfilling her destiny. When the final notes of the concerto rang out, the audience erupted in thunderous applause. Elena stood and bowed gracefully, her face glowing with joy and satisfaction. The orchestra musicians were applauding her as well, and the conductor shook her hand warmly before gesturing for her to take another bow. The standing ovation continued for several minutes, with audience members calling out "Bravo" and throwing flowers onto the stage. Elena looked out into the audience and found her mother's face beaming with pride and love. She also spotted David, Victoria, Robert, and Lisa, all applauding enthusiastically and wiping tears from their eyes. As Elena took her final bow and walked off the stage, she knew that this was just the beginning of her musical journey. There would be more concerts, more challenges, and more opportunities to share her gift with the world. But she would never forget that it all started with a curious girl who watched musicians from the shadows and dared to dream that someday she might join them in the light. The cleaning lady's daughter had become a concert pianist, and the music world would never be the same. Elena's story would inspire countless other young people to believe in their dreams and work toward seemingly impossible goals. And somewhere in the audience that night, there might have been another child watching and learning, getting ready to discover their own extraordinary gift.